Wyoming Territory, 1882. The year the drought stretched longer than memory and trust was harder to find than water. Samuel Kessler stood on the porch of his ranch house, arms crossed as dust curled up from the dirt road. He had not expected to be at the Rawlins Depot today, let alone bringing back a wife. But here he was, boots planted in dry earth, staring at the inside of a covered wagon where a woman sat with her hands folded tight in her lap. "Are you sure?" the station master had asked him earlier. "She's been passed up by 5 men. All of them backed out once they saw her." "You do not have to. I said I'll take her," Samuel had answered, voice low. Now he was watching her study the sky like it might open up and swallow her. She was not crying. She had not cried once on the ride back. That alone had stuck with him. Her name was Margaret Duvall. 24, born in Missouri. No family left, no prospects. She had come west as a mail-order bride but had been turned away by every man who saw her. Samuel never asked why. He had his reasons for doing this, and none of them had to do with pity. "You can come inside now," he said, not unkindly. Margaret nodded, stood, and stepped down from the wagon. Her dress was plain brown, worn but clean. She walked with her spine straight, her face unreadable. Up close, Samuel could see she was not sickly or strange-looking, just closed off, quiet. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and saddle soap. Samuel led her to the main room where the fire flickered low in the hearth. "There is water and soap in the washroom. I will be out in the barn if you need anything." He paused. "I do not expect anything from you, not now, not ever, unless you want to give it." Margaret finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady. "Why did you take me in?" Samuel hesitated. "I needed help around the ranch." "And I figured you needed a place to be." She gave a small nod. "All right." He left her there and stepped out into the yard. The wind was dry and sharp. The cattle were thin. The pasture was harder than stone. He had been trying to hold this place together for 3 years since his father died and left him the land. Lately, it felt like the land was slipping through his fingers. That night, Margaret ate at the table with him without saying much. She listened when Samuel spoke about the ranch, the cattle, the creek that had gone dry last fall. She asked nothing, said even less. But her eyes moved over everything, the walls, the floor, the tools by the door, like she was cataloging it all. The next morning she was up before him. He found her in the kitchen, hair pulled back tight, sleeves rolled, stirring flour into a pot. She had used what little was left in the pantry to make biscuits and broth. It smelled like something warm and good. Samuel blinked, surprised. "I figured we needed to clean out what was going stale," she said. "I will take stock later. If you keep a ledger, I would like to see it." He handed it to her after breakfast. She sat by the fire, flipping pages, frowning. Then she stood and went outside. By the end of the week, things started changing. Margaret moved through the house like she had always been there. She cleaned out the henhouse. She patched the roof on the shed. She reorganized every shelf in the cellar. And she did it all without complaint, just a quiet focus that unsettled Samuel at first. But it was more than that. She had taken to walking the fields in the early morning, sometimes bending down to dig her fingers into the soil. One afternoon, she handed Samuel a list. "What is this?" "Comfrey. Clover, ryegrass. You have too much bare pasture. It is killing the land. Plant these when you can. They will hold moisture, feed the cattle better, and stop the topsoil from blowing." Samuel stared at her. "How do you know that?" "My father was a farmer before he drank himself to death. I learned a few things." He said nothing, just folded the paper and put it in his pocket. She was not soft, not the way some men liked. But there was something in her, a quiet fire, steady and useful. She never tried to impress him. She just did what needed doing. One night, 2 weeks after she arrived, they sat by the fire. Samuel had taken a hit to the ribs fixing a fence. Margaret dipped a cloth in hot water and pressed it gently to his side. "You should have waited for one of the hands," she said. "I do not have many left." She looked up at him. "You do not talk much about what happened. It is all falling apart. I cannot keep hiring help I cannot feed. You will not lose this place." He met her eyes. "How do you know?" "Because I will not let you." Something shifted in the room. Samuel felt it like the way you feel the weather change, no sound, just the air thickening between you. He reached up, touched her wrist. "Why are you doing all this?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Because no one else ever gave me a place to belong. You did." "I do not forget that." He did not kiss her then. He just held her wrist a little longer, then let go. By the end of the month, the ranch was running smoother than it had in years. The cattle were gaining weight. The hens were laying again. Margaret had found a spring farther up the ridge and helped Samuel dig a trench to redirect it toward the troughs. It was not enough to fix everything, but it was a start. People began to notice. The neighbors who had once looked sideways at Samuel for taking in a woman no one else wanted were now asking how he managed to turn things around. He never said much, just tipped his hat and went back to work. One evening after supper, Margaret stood at the edge of the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Samuel came to stand beside her. "You did all this," he said. She turned to him. "No, we did." "I mean it," he said. "Everything started turning when you came here." Margaret looked down, then up again. "Do you regret it, taking me in?" He stepped closer. Not for 1 second. This time he did kiss her slow, certain, like it had been waiting between them for weeks. When they pulled apart, Margaret leaned her head against his chest. "I never thought I would have something like this." Samuel wrapped his arms around her. "Neither did I, but I want it, all of it, with you." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "Then we will build it together." The first frost came early that year, crisping the mornings and turning the tall grass brittle beneath their boots. Margaret had taken to wearing Samuel's old buffalo hide coat when she went out before sunup. The sleeves rolled at the wrists. He never mentioned it, just started leaving it on the peg nearest the door. One morning, she came in with her hands red from cold and her hair wind-tossed beneath a knitted wool shawl. "There's a fox got into the coop last night," she said, setting a bent piece of wire on the table. "Found where he slipped through under the east gate. I'll bury the hen after breakfast." Samuel looked up from where he was oiling a bridle. "I'll put a trap out tonight. You shouldn't be the one to dig that hole." She poured water into the basin and rubbed her hands together. "I already started." Didn't seem right to leave her in the cold. They didn't speak for a moment, just the sound of water sloshing and the brush of leather against cloth. Then she dried her palms and sat across from him. "I was thinking," she said. "Come spring, we could build a smokehouse." "There's too much meat going to waste without it," he nodded slowly. "We've got the ash trees near the lower creek, plenty of wood to start it. I can draw up a plan. I've seen it done before. We'll need stone for the foundation." She didn't wait for permission, just stood, wiped her hands on her apron and went to the back room, returning with a stub of pencil and a sheet of folded paper. Samuel watched her sketch, her brow furrowed, her mouth in a quiet line of focus. There was no hesitation in her hands, no questions. Just a quiet certainty that whatever needed doing, she would do it. By the end of the week, she'd marked out the smokehouse boundaries behind the shed and started hauling stones herself. Samuel joined her after sundown, after the horses were fed and the fence line checked. "You always work this hard?" he asked, setting a flat granite slab beside her. "When there's something worth working for." That night, she stayed out after he'd gone in, lantern lit beside her, sleeves streaked with dirt. He watched her from the window as she smoothed the outlines of the wall again, running her hand along the earth like she was memorizing it. The next morning, he found a linen sack on the table inside, a bundle of dried herbs and a folded note in her careful handwriting. "For your ribs." She didn't mention it when he came in, just glanced once at his side, then returned to kneading dough. Later that week, they rode into Rawlins together. Supply lists had grown long, and Samuel needed to barter for nails, salt, and seed. Margaret rode beside him, steady in the saddle, her hair tucked beneath a felt bonnet. She didn't flinch when a group of ranch hands whistled low as they passed. One of them, a man with a dust-coated coat and a scar beneath his eye, stepped forward when Samuel began loading the wagon. "That your wife?" he asked, nodding toward Margaret. Samuel didn't answer. Didn't think anyone take her in. Heard a lot of men turned her loose. Samuel's jaw tightened. "You done?" The man gave a half shrug. "Didn't mean nothing by it. Just saying you must have been real desperate." Margaret stepped around the wagon before Samuel could reply. Her voice was calm and even. "Desperate's a word men use when they mean to shame a woman for surviving." The man blinked. She turned to Samuel. "We've got what we came for. Let's go." They rode home in silence, but that night, while she stitched a tear in one of the saddle blankets, Samuel sat beside her on the floor and spoke quietly. "You didn't have to answer him." "I wasn't answering him," she said, not looking up. "I was answering the part of me that still thinks I'm not worth keeping." He reached out, brushing a loose thread from her cheek. "You are worth keeping, worth everything." Her hands went still. "I don't know how to be someone's wife in the way folks expect. I'm not expecting anything but what you give." She set the needle down slowly. "Then I think I could be yours." He took her hand and held it there between them, the fire warming their skin. By midwinter, the smokehouse stood solid behind the shed, its stones mortared clean and tight. They'd cured their first side of venison by the new year, and the root cellar was lined with jars Margaret had bartered from a woman down the valley in exchange for a bolt of flannel. One morning, just after dawn, Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway holding a small wooden box. "I found this in the attic," she said. "It's your mother's, isn't it?" Samuel wiped his hands and took it gently. The lid opened with a soft creak. Inside were pressed wildflowers, a silver comb, and a yellowed letter folded 3 times. "She used to pick these by the creek," he said. Margaret brushed a petal with her fingertip. "I never knew her, but I think I would have liked her." He looked at her then, really looked. "She would have loved you." Margaret closed the box and set it on the mantel, beside the iron candlestick. "Then I'll keep it close." They stood quiet a while, the light rising slow through the window panes, the scent of wood smoke curling soft through the room. The house no longer felt like something he was trying to hold together. It felt like something they'd built, something that would last. The wind carried a sting by late February, but the snow had thinned enough that Samuel could ride the upper ridge again, where the grass came in patchy, and the fence line gave way to stone. He'd taken the gray gelding, the one that favored its left leg on hills, and come back with a cold bite in his fingers and a rolled map of the boundary tucked into his coat. Margaret stood beside the open barn door when he returned, a length of muslin pinned across her chest and a charcoal line between her fingers. "You're back later than I expected," she said, eyes narrowing at the sight of his chapped knuckles. "I had to check where the spring runoff's headed. Looks like it'll miss the lower troughs unless I dig a second swale." She brushed her charcoal onto the feed ledger, closing it neatly. "I'll help mark the grade. The ground's still soft enough to cut." He slid off the horse and handed her the reins. "You've been in the barn most of the day, sorting nails. All that rusted iron we pulled from the shed still usable if we oil it right. And I found the rest of your mother's seed jars. They were behind the oat sacks." Samuel leaned against the post, his shoulders stiff from the ride. "Any of it still good?" She gave a short nod. Beans, mostly. A few white squash. I'll test them in damp cloth before we plant. A silence passed, but it didn't press on either of them. Wind stirred the straw near the doorway. The gelding stamped once, then settled. "You ever think about what you'd have done?" he said finally. "If you hadn't come here." Margaret's eyes lifted to his. "I try not to. Most of the time I didn't let myself think past the next meal." He looked toward the hills, jaw tight. "It's not right, what they did to you." Passing judgment without knowing a thing. Her voice stayed level. "I spent too many years trying to make myself easy to want. Didn't work, did it?" He turned to her, voice low. "Worked on me." She didn't smile, but something gentled in her expression. "You weren't looking for a wife." "I wasn't. But I was hoping to find something that held." Margaret stepped closer, the reins still loose in her hand. "I've been thinking about the north field. If we clear the scrub, we could use it for root vegetables. Beets, maybe. Parsnips." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "You looking to stay through another winter?" Her voice caught just barely. "I'm not looking to leave." They stood like that a moment longer, the distance between them narrowing more from shared silence than touch. By March, Margaret had constructed a cold frame from salvaged window glass and timber scraps. Samuel came in from the paddock one morning and found her crouched beside it, breath fogging the pane as she checked the soil's warmth with the back of her hand. "Seems early," he said. "Only by a week or two," she replied. "If we can get the greens started now, we'll have something fresh by April. The hens'll lay better with scraps." He crouched beside her, boots crunching frost. "You always think that far ahead." "I have to," she said, brushing soil from her fingers. "I spent too long living day to day." He watched her a moment. "You're not just saving this place, you know." She looked at him, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You're teaching me how to stay in it." That night she reached for his hand as they sat by the hearth. No words passed between them, just the quiet weight of fingers laced together, the warmth of firelight on their skin. In early April, the first shoots pushed through the soil, pale green and curling. Margaret pressed her palm lightly to the earth that morning and said nothing, but Samuel saw the way her shoulders eased, like something inside her had finally let go. They built the second swale with stone from the creek, and when the rains came, the water caught just where they needed it. The troughs filled. The cattle stopped pawing the earth for drink. One of the heifers calved early and took to nursing without fuss. One evening, Samuel returned from the far pasture to find Margaret waiting on the porch, a folded cloth in her hands. "I mended your work shirt," she said, offering it. Caught the tear before it spread. He took it, fingers brushing hers. "You didn't have to." She glanced down. "I wanted to." When he reached for her, it wasn't sudden. It was a slow, sure thing, like the thaw that came inch by inch across the land, gentle and steady. His arms wrapped around her waist, hers around his back, and they stood there beneath the porch eave while the last of the light faded behind the hills. "I want you here," he said into her hair. "Not just for the land, not just for what you do." She pulled back just enough to see his face. "Then you have me." They didn't need ceremony to mark it, no paper, no preacher. Just the kind of vow made in 1,000 daily acts, a mended sleeve, a shared morning, a name spoken gently across a quiet room. By the time wildflowers bloomed along the fence line, the ranch had steadied. The land was healing, and so were they. And at the center of it all stood Margaret, no longer the woman no one wanted, but the one who'd been worth everything. By late spring, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out in a pale shimmer, and the riverbed, dry the previous year, now pulsed steady with meltwater from the high ridge. Samuel rode out at dawn most mornings, checking the back line where a pair of wild dogs had been running cattle off the edge trail. He left Margaret with a new wood plane and a bench of rough pine boards she'd requested, without saying why. When he returned one afternoon, sweat at his collar and a gash across his forearm from a barbed wire splice, he found her under the lean-to beside the house. A row of narrow cedar boxes stretched across the sawhorse. "Bees," she said before he could ask. "There's a wild hive in the hollow pine past the north fence. I've been watching their path." Samuel blinked at the small, precise dovetails she'd carved into the frame corners. "You planning to keep them?" "If I can coax them into these, yes. The flowers are better this year. If we're lucky, we'll have comb honey by summer's end." His eyes moved from the boxes to her hands, where a thin line of ash dusted her knuckles. "You think of all this on your own?" "I read about it once. My mother kept bees before she took ill. I remembered the way she hummed near the hives." Said the sound calmed her. Samuel stepped closer. "You never talked about her before." "I was 12 when she passed. My father drank more after that. I stopped asking questions." He watched her brush shavings from the last box, her face quiet but not closed. "You talk when you're ready." "I'll listen." That evening, Margaret placed a bowl of water near the edge of the porch, a flat stone inside it for the bees. She sat beside it as the sun dipped low, her back pressed against one of the porch posts, her forehead resting lightly on her knees. Samuel joined her but didn't speak. They watched a single honeybee circle, land and drink. The next day, Margaret took the gelding and rode out alone for the first time, saddlebag packed with burlap and a jar of sugar syrup. She didn't ask permission. She left a note scrawled on the edge of the feed ledger. "Gone to speak with the hive." Samuel spent the morning fixing the axle on the hay cart, glancing toward the ridge every half hour. When he saw her riding back, the burlap now tied around a thick branch trailing sap, he exhaled through his teeth and met her halfway. "They followed," she said simply, lifting the branch. He took it from her hands, careful not to jostle the cluster of bees clinging to the bark. "You're not afraid?" "I was. Then I remembered fear doesn't feed anything." They settled the hive boxes behind the shed, tucked against the slope where the afternoon sun warmed the wood. Margaret stood back, arms crossed, watching the bees slip in and out of the slits she'd carved in the lid. Samuel turned toward her. "I never thought I'd see bees back on this land. I never thought I'd be the one to bring them." Later, as she washed her hands in the basin, he stepped behind her, resting his palm on her shoulder. "You've done more than bring bees," he said. "You've changed this place." She met his eyes in the rippled mirror above the washstand. "I didn't know if I could. When I came here, I just needed somewhere to stop running." "You stopped," he said. "And you stayed." That night, the hens roosted early, and the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Margaret lit the oil lamp in the bedroom and unpinned her hair without a word. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching the soft fall of it over her shoulders. She turned toward him, voice low. "I want to belong here, not just in the house or the field, but with you." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands finding her waist as hers rose to his chest. "You do," he said. "You've belonged since the moment you set foot on this land." They lay down together with no hesitation, no ceremony, just the quiet certainty of 2 people who had walked through fire to find each other. Morning came slow, gold light soft on the floorboards. Margaret rose first, her step light as she pulled on her skirt and stepped into the kitchen. Samuel followed, bare feet on cool wood. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and passed him one without a word. He took it, wrapped his fingers over hers for a moment before letting go. He looked around the kitchen, the shelves now labeled in her script, the dried wildflowers hanging by the window, the smell of yeast rising from the covered bowl on the hearth, and felt something settle in his chest he'd never known before. Peace, hard-won and deeply rooted. Outside, the bees began their slow morning flight, the first of them lifting into the warming air. Margaret watched them a long time, her cup in hand, her shoulders relaxed. Samuel stood beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her arm against his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The days stretched longer by mid-May, sun rising early over the hills and warming the boards of the porch before breakfast. The bees had settled into their new boxes, and Margaret had started sketching a second row of planting beds beside the smokehouse, her boots dusted with pollen and her sleeves damp from watering. Samuel caught her one morning crouched low beside the stone path, her hand resting still on her belly. She didn't speak when he stepped closer, just glanced up with a look that stayed with him all day. That evening he found her sitting in the barn loft, knees drawn up, the last light catching the edge of her jaw. He climbed the ladder slow, pausing halfway. "You've been quiet since yesterday," she shifted, pulling her shawl tighter across her lap. "I wasn't sure how to tell you," he waited. "I think I'm carrying." The words landed soft but sure. She didn't flinch when she said them, and she didn't look away. He climbed the last rung and sat beside her in the hay, the air around them warm with the scent of horses and dust. "You're certain?" "I know my body, and I've counted the weeks." He reached out, his hand resting gently where hers had been earlier that morning. "You're not afraid?" he asked. "Not in the way I would have been before," she said. "Not with you." Samuel exhaled slow, his thumb tracing the edge of her hand. "We'll make room. I'll build another cradle. The one my mother used is too rotted by now." Margaret smiled, a small, quiet thing. "I want them to grow up knowing what steadiness feels like." "They will," he said, "because they'll come from you." They sat a while longer, the wind moving through the rafters above them. When they climbed down, she took his arm without hesitation, her fingers curled around the crook of his elbow. The next day, Samuel hitched the wagon and drove into Rawlins, returning with lumber, muslin, and a parcel of dried apples Margaret had once mentioned craving. She didn't ask how he remembered. As spring turned toward summer, the ranch moved in rhythm with their days. Margaret's outlines for the new beds took shape, and Samuel built raised frames from the leftover cedar. The bees began filling the combs with a pale amber honey, and the cattle grazed deeper into the north pasture, no longer thin from the drought. One afternoon, while Margaret swept the porch, a rider came up the trail. Samuel stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag, and met the man halfway. It was Thomas Rayner, a neighbor from 2 valleys over, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "Got a sick colt," he said, dismounting. "Couldn't get the vet from town. I remembered you used to run with the McAllens, figured you might still have a hand for it." Margaret stepped down from the porch, already tying her hair back. "I can come." Rayner hesitated, glancing at her belly. "I'm not due for months yet," she said, firm but calm. "And I know what to do with a twisted gut." Samuel watched her gather her satchel and climb into the wagon. The colt was saved by dusk, and when they returned, Margaret moved slow but steady, her fingers stained with liniment. "You didn't need to prove anything," he said as she washed up. "I wasn't. I just didn't want to forget who I am." He dried her hands with the cloth she passed him. "I don't want you to." They spent that night on the porch, a blanket wrapped around them, her head against his shoulder as the stars blinked to life above the ridge. By July, the garden bore cucumbers and sweet peas, and Margaret's belly rounded beneath her dresses. Samuel built a rocker for the front room, carving the arms smooth and low. She sewed linen wraps from the muslin he'd brought back, each stitch even and small. One morning, a letter arrived from Missouri, addressed in a hand Margaret hadn't seen in years. It was from her mother's cousin, who'd heard through someone in Rawlins that Margaret had married and settled. The letter spoke of kin lost and kin remaining, and ended with a single line. "It eases my heart to know you found a home." Margaret folded the letter once, and set it in the drawer beside the comb that had belonged to Samuel's mother. That night, she lit a candle on the mantel and placed a sprig of dried clover beneath it. "For her," she said, "and for the girl I was before I found my feet." Samuel held her hand as the candle burned low. In late August, as the wind turned and the grasses began to dry gold, Margaret woke Samuel in the gray light before dawn. "It's time." He didn't hesitate. The cradle stood ready, the linens clean. She labored through the morning with Samuel near, his hand steady on her back, his voice low when she needed it. Their daughter was born just past noon, with the strong lungs of a storm and a grip like wire. Margaret held her close, sweat on her brow and tears she didn't try to hide. Samuel knelt beside the bed, one hand on Margaret's shoulder, the other cupping the baby's foot. "She's perfect," he said. Margaret looked down at the tiny face nestled against her chest. "I want to name her Ruth," he nodded. "For your mother, for every woman who never had a place to stay." They stayed like that a long time, the three of them wrapped in the hush of a house that had weathered so much and now held something wholly new. Autumn came in gentle, the light slanting earlier through the windows, the bees beginning to slow their flights. Margaret walked the yard with Ruth bundled against her chest, pointing to the trees, the barn, the fields where potatoes still ripened beneath the soil. Samuel joined her when he could, carrying Ruth when Margaret's arms tired, humming low tunes his mother once sang. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Margaret in the rocker, Samuel on the floor by her feet, their daughter asleep between them. One night, as the wind moved soft outside and the house stood quiet, Margaret looked over at Samuel. "You remember when you said you hoped to find something that held?" He turned toward her, his eyes warm. "You found it," she said, "and so did I." He reached up, cupping her cheek. "We built it. Together." She leaned down, kissed him slow and sure. Then she rested her head against his, their daughter sleeping soundly between them, the firelight casting soft shadows across the floor. And with the season cooling around them and love rooted deep in the boards of their home, they stayed that way for a long, quiet while whole, certain, and unshakably together.